Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I'm your host, resident oceanographer, Jim Assa. Okay, this is one of those articles that I just featured um, in the sea ice melt video. And this is an extremely lengthy article, so I will not go through this in detail because if I did, it'd be a 3 hour long video. But I will hit upon the important points here, and I will leave the URL again, like I did before, for those of you who want to examine this in greater detail at your own convenience and so forth. So we're looking at here is the Atlantic water heat transport variability in the 20th century Arctic Ocean from a global ocean model and observations. This was published in October 2018 in the JGR Oceans, Journal of Geophysical Research. So here's the abstract. Northward ocean heat transport and its variability influence the Arctic sea ice cover, contribute to surface warming or cooling, or simply warm or cool the Arctic Ocean interior. In other words, intermediate, deeper layers. A simulation with the Forest Global Ocean Model, NOR-ESN 20CR, aided by hydrographic observations since 1900, show large decadal fluctuations in the ocean heat transport, with the largest variations in the Atlantic sector. The simulated net poleward ocean heat transport over the last century is about 68 terawatts. Tera, you recall, is 10 to the 12th. 88% of this occurs in the Barents Sea opening, about 45 terawatts, and the Fram Strait, 15 terawatts. Typical variations of 40 terawatts over time scales between 5 and 10 years related to thermohaline and wind stress forcings. The mean heat transport in the Davis Strait is about 10 terawatts and less than 5 terawatt flows north in the Bering Strait. The core temperature of the Atlantic water, and throughout they call it AW, entering the Arctic Ocean has increased in recent decades, consistent with an ongoing expansion of the Atlantic domain, also known as Atlantification. And of course, the core temperature of land water, that's due to the ocean heat content warming up all the way down to 2,000 meters, with the upper 5 to 700 meters seeing extremely a lot of zettajoules of energy being absorbed. And the Atlantic water that moves in is typically surface and intermediate water, which takes you down to about 500 meters or so, plus or minus. Earlier warm events are also documented. The temperature of the northward flowing Atlantic water thus plays a vital role with decadal variations around 0.5 degrees C. The Nordic Sea's atmosphere contributes with thermodynamic forcing, dampening the advected heat anomalies. In the Barents Sea, variations in the inflow volume flux dominate. That's referring to sphere drips, how much water moving in, while variations in temperature dominate the heat transport in the Fram Strait. There are significant trends over recent decades, also dominated by the Barents Sea, that presently has one sphere drip higher volume transport and about 1 degree C warmer Atlantic water than the long-term mean. This may not seem like much. That is a significant amount right here. One sphere drip higher volume transport, 1 degree warmer water. That is significant. That's a lot of heat to be bringing in. And increased volume means you're bringing more of the heat. Okay, plain language summary. Ocean currents bring heat northward into the Arctic Ocean. All right, there we go. This ocean heat influences sea ice cover regionally and warms the Arctic Ocean surface and interior. Warm, salty Atlantic water enters the Arctic Ocean through the Fram Strait, and the Barents Sea dominates the oceanic heat distribution to the Arctic Ocean in the 20th century, and now into the 21st century. In this study, we investigated how ocean heat transport has varied over time, which physical mechanisms influence these variations. They say we look at the models, blah, blah, blah. We find that ocean heat transport has varied on different timescales. These variations are linked to changes in wind systems in the Nordic Sea, atmosphere ocean heat exchanges, and to a lesser extent, local winds in the straits. Overall, the ocean heat transports and Atlantic water temperatures have increased during recent decades. These changes are especially large at the Barents Sea entrance, where the water has warmed by 1 degree C. And when it warms, it's also bringing a higher salinity content. So I did a video called "The Landification of the Barents Sea," discussing that very issue. So now the intro. A shrinking cryosphere, including accelerated loss of Arctic sea ice, is one of the many indicators of global scale warming. The Arctic, as an example, has lost more than half of its sea ice volume over the last 40 years. That's volume. The extent, of course, is also declining. The rise of surface air temperature has been anomalously large at high northern latitudes, a feature often termed Arctic amplification. Right? I'm sure you're all familiar with that, Arctic amplification. In recent years, the surface warming has been the largest in the Barents Sea, where the position of the sea ice edge has been linked to variations in the inflow of Atlantic water. For future decades and centuries, still an open research question as to the extent the Arctic Ocean will be dominated by enhanced warming. And then they say through the surface will increase poleward ocean heat transport. Okay. Oceanic heat enters the Arctic Ocean as Atlantic water through the Fram Strait and the Barents Sea, and as Pacific water through the Bering Strait. Based on early observations, Agard, back in '89, suggested that Atlantic water should be the most important oceanic heat supply to the Arctic Ocean. Historical observations show a warming trend in core temperature of Atlantic water entering the Arctic Ocean over the last few decades. And they cite a bunch of folks here, including my friend Igor Polyakov. The interaction between Arctic water, Pacific water, and Arctic sea ice has in previous studies been discussed due to the strongly stratified cold halocline layer. In the Arctic Ocean, the surface water tends to have a reduced salinity, leading to a halocline. We get that sharp change in the salinity. Well, now if we're starting to infuse Atlantic water, even though it's warmer, it is a much higher salinity, so it's more dense. It will sink and start to displace the water at intermediate depth, but then that will contribute to a sharper halocline that occurs. And then the temporal spatial variations, Woodgate, 2006, and some recent research that she has done. The sea ice near the inflow regions may respond passively to variations in the Atlantic and Pacific water heat transports. Recent studies suggest a direct effect on sea ice loss both in the Eurasian and the Canada basins. Again, Igor and Dr. Rebecca Woodgate. The recent change in the Eurasian basin has, by Polyakov, been discussed as part of the Atlantification of the Arctic Ocean. That is an expansion of the Atlantic domain. Nansen, back in 1902, that's what we get the Nansen bottle named for, already identified Atlantic water as the key heat source for the Arctic Ocean. It's pretty remarkable in 1902 for him to figure that out, considering the technology or lack of back then. Basically, he was just dropping his bottle and measuring the temperature. And he figured it out that way. Pretty remarkable. Roles of the different Atlantic water branches in transporting heat variability are still not clear, especially on decadal, multi-decadal timescales. A portion of the suggested Atlantification and recent warming has been attributed to the current human-induced global warming. And then they talk about the past warm Atlantic water back in the 30s and 40s. So what they're basically saying is these warmings in Atlantic water may be both anthropogenic forcing and just simple variations over the decades. They talk about how they organize the paper. Background. The warm and salty Atlantic water enters the Nordic Sea, consisting of Greenland, Iceland, Norwegian seas, Jin Sea, right? which you see right here. And then they took this and they blow it up here. So here are the entrances here. This side is the Fram Strait, and that side is more from the Barents opening. You see that here, and they plot in sea surface temperature. So you can clearly see the warmer Atlantic water here meeting up with the cooler Arctic Ocean. After it's entered the Nordic seas, the Atlantic water continues northward toward the Arctic Ocean. Two different branches: a western branch that feeds the interior of the Norwegian Sea, and an eastern branch more commonly known as the Norwegian Atlantic Slope Current, flowing northward as a near barotropic shelf edge current. The barotropic baroclinic, it's the manifestation of how the layers in the ocean uh, propagate, move about. That's extremely complex physics here. You don't need to worry about that here for our purposes. If anyone's interested, I'll do a video explaining the difference between barotropic and baroclinic. Off the northern coast of Norway, the Norwegian Atlantic slope current divides in two branches, one entering the Barents Sea, and hence called the Barents Sea opening, and the other, the West Spitsbergen current, flowing northward past Svalbard and into the Fram Strait. A large part of the latter current recirculates westward in the Fram Strait and joins the southward flowing East Greenland current towards the Denmark Strait, forming a cyclonic loop counterclockwise in the Nordic seas. Barents Sea is one of the shallow, about 200 meters deep shelf seas as part of the Arctic continental shelf. The Atlantic water that enters here is cooled before it enters the deep Arctic Ocean through the St. Anna Trough. Relatively warm and saline Pacific water enters the Arctic Ocean through the shallow 50-meter and narrow 85-kilometer Bering Strait. This Pacific water then flows through the Chukchi Sea, where it's modified by heat exchange, runoff, ice formation, ice melt, before it finally enters the deep, should be Canada Basin, at the shelf break. The Pacific water is less saline and colder than the Atlantic water, and it's mainly confined to the Canada Basin. Okay, it's less saline and colder, so it's not going to be as dense. Although the mean Pacific water temperature is quite low, the summer Pacific water is relatively warm and plays an important role in the hydrographic conditions and sea ice in the region. Rebecca Woodgate has been doing a lot of the research into examining what goes through the Bering Strait and what that happens in the Arctic. And they go on to talk about, how they have moorings. Woodgate gave an estimate of the mean volume transport of Pacific water through the Bering Strait, about 1 Sverdrup, with a corresponding mean heat transport of approximately 12 terawatts. And I shared that with you in the sea ice melt video. Volume transports vary from 0.4 Sverdrup in winter to 1.3 Sverdrup in summer. Temperatures vary from freezing temperatures in winter to 4 degrees C in summer. Variability in volume is explained by a combination of local winds, variation of the large-scale pressure difference between the Pacific and the Arctic. It's a reference to the atmospheric forcings. We also have to look at the Pacific decadal oscillation, the Arctic oscillation, Arctic dipole, and so forth. Despite its comparatively small volume and heat contribution, the inflow of Pacific water through the Bering Strait, especially the timing of heat input, has a large impact on the sea ice cover in the western Arctic Ocean. And I think I demonstrated that to you in that sea ice melt video. Final connection between the Arctic Ocean and Atlantic Ocean is through the Canadian Arctic archipelago via the Davis Strait. Due to low temperatures, the heat transport through Davis Strait has a maximum positive value of 18 to 20 terawatts. Okay. Then they talk about long-term variability and that the Atlantic warming has not been constant in time. Again, Igor's work. A local maximum observed in the mid-1990s, followed by a minimum, where the warming slowed and a slight cooling took place. Makes you wonder, what is the North Atlantic oscillation? What is the Arctic oscillation doing? And even to a smaller extent, What is the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, sometimes called the Atlantic multidecadal variation? What are those effects? And then they go on to say, recent anomalies in the Atlantic water inflow warmer than previously observed. They still think that parts of it can be attributed to multidecadal fluctuations with a time scale of 50 to 80 years. This is now a new aspect of the Atlantic multidecadal variability variation. The, 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 the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation deals with the cyclical changes in sea surface temperature from warm to cool and so on. And that's usually a 10 to 20-year period. And if it's warmer, that might fuel more powerful hurricanes, that kind of stuff. There's this new 50 to 80 years of fluctuation that's being examined. The Atlantic water temperature records in the Arctic Ocean show two warmer periods, one in the 30s to 40s, and then one in the 90s to 2000. Two colder periods, one early in the 1900s and the second one in the 60s to 70s. And as you can tell, Igor kind of looks a lot of that. Also in the Barents Sea, the Atlantic water temperature shows substantial variation on decadal timescales. These low-frequency variation in Atlantic water temperature agree well with the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation index of Sutton and Hodson, representing the large-scale sea surface temperature variation throughout the North Atlantic. So, they talk about in the Barents Sea, Atlantic water temperature shows variations over decades. Ellen Hansen and Nansen in 1909 were the first to give a comprehensive description of the hydrographic conditions in the Norwegian Barents Sea and the relationship between the two. I mean, this is incredible work that they did 110 years ago. Both thermodynamic atmospheric forcing and changes in ocean volume transport have been suggested to explain the above-mentioned temperature heat anomalies. Mork found that the heat fluxes are responsible for about half of the observed interannual heat content variability, but the fraction is non-stationary in time. And exactly what it says, it fluctuates. Variations in Atlantic water volume are clearly important because if you have more water, if you increase the shear drop, the volume moving in, that water is usually warmer, so you're going to bring more heat in. So it's not just the temperature, but how the variation in the transport itself that will vary, and that will influence the responses in the temperatures that we see. Variation in Atlantic water volume are clearly important, but explaining the forcing mechanism for this flow is an ongoing research question. The flow is likely to be both thermohaline and wind-driven, with the relative role of the forcing components varying on different timescales. A major part of the thermohaline forcing is the cooling of Atlantic water as it moves northward. This generates an outflow of denser waters from the Nordic seas. This outflow lowers the sea surface height in the Nordic seas and acts as a quote-unquote pull mechanism, brings it along, in other words. And this has been demonstrated by several sites. Other sites have looked at wind-driven forcing. Basically, wind blows across the water, and it creates a stress, the water responds to that. The North Atlantic Oscillation is the dominant mode of variability in the North Atlantic region, has been associated with interannual decadal variations in the Atlantic water inflow by numerous studies. It's been suggested the North Atlantic Oscillation affects the volume of Atlantic water entering the Barents Sea, and hence the fraction of water that recirculates or reaches the Fram Strait. Zhang et al. Showed that during periods with strong NAO, the Atlantic water inflow was stronger, had an anomalous eastward extension, resulting in less water being recirculated in the Nordic Sea, more entering the Barents Sea. However, other studies found that the flow through the Barents Sea opening, BSO, is also highly dependent on local wind patterns and positive wind stress curl in the Barents Sea, which in turn sets up Ekman transport toward the coast. That's basically Ekman onshore transport. Depending which way the wind blows will determine which way the Ekman transport is. Because the Ekman transport will be 90 degrees to the right of the wind direction. So basically the wind would be blowing, from the Nordic side toward the Siberian side, and with Coriolis there's basically what's called an onshore Ekman transport, onshore pumping. Interesting. Smedrud and others found that the NAO correlation broke down after 2000, and that the flow into the Barents Strait opening was strongly affected by northern Barents Sea winds. This is interesting, and it broke down after 2000. That could possibly be anthropogenic. And then they go through all the datas and the models and so on. If you're interested, you can read that for yourself. They go through an extensive heat volume transport. Let's see if this will, there we go. So they have the red is the Fram Strait. The green, is that green? Ooh, might have to increase that so I can see what the colors are, the color code. Okay, green is the Bering, blue is the Davis Strait, and the dot is the Atlantic Water Fram Strait. Okay. So, so, so the Bering is pretty much consistent. And when you look at this, you can see that's probably that cool period, that this one here and this one there, probably those cool periods. Total volume of transport. So we see the those two low periods there, and I'm willing to bet you it's your heat transport that they kind of correspond. When you have a reduced volume transport, you have a reduced heat transport as well. So there, when you look at this, there does appear to be a cyclical aspect to it, but I would argue that when you look, if you were to fit a curve through this, we would see a positive slope indicating that heat transport is increasing over time. See that true for through the Fram, through the Davis, and the Atlantic Water Fram Strait as well. And here's the Bering, and you can see a slight increase, but there you have it. So this is showing a nice correlation between transport and heat, but then when you look overall, we see an increasing heat content. And it'll be interesting to see what the curve is fit through here. It would appear to be a positive slope. Whether the slope is significant from zero, I would need to see the regression analyses on that. They make a statement here that the Bering Strait opening is the largest contributor of oceanic heat to the Arctic, followed by the Fram Strait. And that was summarized up above in the abstract. Here's interesting. The northward volume transport in the Fram Strait is correlated, R equals 0.65, with the Atlantic water flow through the Bering Strait opening, Bering Strait opening, and can vary up to 1 Sverdrup from year to year. The Atlantic water volume transport anti-correlated with the outflows through the East Greenland Current and Davis Strait. R is minus 0.87. Because the volume in the Arctic Ocean is conserved, both Fram Strait and Barents Strait opening volume heat transports have prominent periods of 5 to 7, 7 to 8 years. Volume transport through the Barents Strait opening has shown an increasing trend since the 60s. Okay, a word about correlated. When we do statistical analyses, we have two measures. One is called R square, which basically is a measure of how well the data fits the model, whatever the function may be. Values for R squared goes from 0 to 1. 0 means it's complete crap. The data points, the observed data does not match the curve at all. 1 is a perfect fit, meaning that every single data observation is directly on the curve. Of course, you're never going to get that, but those range of the values. So R squared tells you how well the data fits the function. R shows you how well the independent and dependent variables are correlated. Notice how well they track each other. Values from R range from -1 to +1. 0 means no correlation. So if you go on the positive side towards 1, that means they're positively correlated. You increase one, the other increases as well. -1 means they're negatively correlated. If you increase one, the other decreases, but they decrease well in response. Think of a straight line that has a positive slope. You would have, R value of 1. If it has a negative slope, you have an R value of -1 because the functions respond well to each other. The dependent variable responds very well to the independent variable. A common mistake my stats students used to make was I would give them a scenario and I'd say calculate R squared and R. So they calculate R squared and they simply take the square root of R squared to give me R. And that is wrong. But anyway, so that's just a brief explanation of what those values are. When we consider the long-term changes in simulated heat transport, all straits show a small increasing trend throughout the 120-year integration period. The trend is the largest in the Fram Strait and Barents Sea opening. And as I showed you, when you look at recent years, the trend is increasing. So let's look at Atlantic water temperature variability. Excuse me. Got the Barents Sea opening in red. Was a Sunoy section in yellow, West Spitsbergen Current in green, and the Fram Strait in blue. So they're basically looking for this study over the last 90 years or so. The dashed line showed the linear trend from 1980 through 2012. That's the thick ones. The light ones are the going further back in time. So when you look at, for example, the blue represents the Fram Strait, and this is the temperature of the water. We definitely see an increase in the water temperature. Same thing in the Barents Sea. We see an increase in the temperature content of the Barents Sea. So that it's bringing that heat, extra heat, into the Arctic Ocean. Very, very straightforward there. So let's look at temperature variability. So anomaly time series, of simulated black line observed within magenta line of annual mean Atlantic water temperatures. These are variabilities. So these be like anomalies. And we can see it's a little cooler in the early part of the 20th century. A little warm spell in the late 30s. But when we, aside from a little dip down in the 2010 or so, and some of these other, there is a little bit of a oscillatory nature here, but overall, integrating over the area, we see that it's warming up overall, and that's the simulated black line. The observed is the magenta line, which is here. Does the model agree well with the data? Some spots yes, some spots no. That's the Fram Strait. Let's look at the Barents Sea. A little more heat in the Barents Sea there. Sort of an okay correlation between the observed and the modeling. Okay, discussion. We have established that the heat transport through the Fram Strait and Barents Sea opening are dominating ocean heat transport anomalies toward the Arctic Ocean. These depend on both fluctuation in volume and temperature. Furthermore, the relative importance of these vary in time. Next, forcing mechanism of variations heat and volume transport in both the BSO and FS and relative roles of ocean advection will be assessed. So to show a cyclical aspect to the flow in Sea drips, and this is the combined Fram Strait and Barents Sea opening. And then here's the NAO index. And let's see. There does seem to be some correlation between what the NAO is doing and what the transport is. Okay? Remember what the NAO is? It's the how the high and low pressure systems off Iceland and the Canaries are what they're doing, and that's going to affect current movement because you have wind stress, wind pushes on the water, so that's going to affect that. Not only the direction, but the magnitude of it. And that's the wind stress curl. Okay? And again, when looking at the transport, The NAO index and the forcing, this is newtons per meter, wind stress curl. Curl is a tendency to rotate. Okay? This is showing a decent correlation. Then they did a 30-year smoothing. I guess to try and show some sort of decadal aspect, if any. Here, this is showing the flow and sphere drops, the Barents Sea opening, Fram Strait, recirculation. This is the recirculation, that little cyclonic pathway they described earlier. Barents Sea opening, the Fram Strait is a Novaya Zemlya. And at the volume, you can see that the Barents Sea opening contributes a lot more volume. I think SLH is sea level height. So what they're talking about here is what the winds are doing. As I just mentioned, what the winds are doing to the the forcing on the surface and how that affects the currents. Also what's the strength of the winds. With the North Atlantic Oscillation, not only is it the positioning of the lows and the highs, around Iceland and Canaries, or the corresponding wind strength. So that basically what they're showing is that, and I showed you in that graphic, there is a correlation with the NAO and the sphere drop and the wind stress. Basically, this is affecting the volume of water that's being moved, makes sense. And if the volume is being affected, the heat content will be affected. Now, according to them, they provide a gliding 30-year correlation, volume transport, and this points towards changes in the atmospheric circulation with a different regional variations. The Atlantic water that enters through the Barents Strait opening prevents sea ice to form because of the heat it brings with it that then diffuses upward. More of its heat is lost to the atmosphere. Basically, saying that this difference needs to be examined. Nordic Sea's Atlantic water heat transport shows the anomalies of ocean atmosphere heat flux and the heat budget. So QRES equals Q north minus Q, that's one of those models, minus Q west minus Q surface. Q is what we use for heat. So this is the Q residual, basically, what is left over. Okay, so in terawatts here, and we see a very strong indication in all of these of some sort of cyclical aspect taking place. And even the ocean to atmosphere heat flux here. This is just, the first two panels was inflow heat transport and outflow heat transport. And then we're looking at the actual heat going from the ocean to the atmosphere. And we see sort of a mild cyclical aspect. And the same thing for heat storage. Be interesting to see what happens for the last 10 years. So in all these panels here, it shows a cyclical aspect. So what drives the ocean heat anomalies? Volume transport can partly explain the heat transport anomalies. Advective temperature, local atmospheric thermodynamic forcing are also important. We have to look at the heat budget, which I just kind of showed you briefly. Heat transport anomalies are largely dependent on temperature. Makes sense. So they looked at that, and they show that there's a high lag correlation. Makes sense because water has a higher specific heat, so it's going to take longer to warm up and therefore longer to cool down. So while you may quickly cool, say heat up the air, the water won't as quickly warm up. It takes longer. Okay. So conclusion. Northward ocean heat transport and variability influence the Arctic sea ice cover, leads to surface warming or cooling, or simply warm or cool the Arctic Ocean interior. The variability thus likely plays an important role in Arctic amplification, thermal expansion of the cold, dense Arctic deep waters, or low frequency variability of the Arctic sea ice cover. Simulated ocean heat transport, about 68 terawatts, 88% of this in the Atlantic sector in the Barents opening, and the Fram Strait accounts for the other 12%. Northward flowing Atlantic water dominates its ocean heat transport, has typical variability of plus or minus 40 terawatts over time scales between 5 and 10 years. Much of the variability is wind-driven. Think of the NAO. The Atlantic water volume transport variability shows high correlation with the wind stress curl in Nordic seas and Northern Atlantic, and is clearly dependent on the large-scale wind patterns also seen in the North Atlantic Oscillation. Temperature variations in the Atlantic water also plays a vital role, understandable, with poleward flowing anomalies of about plus or minus 0.5 degrees C. The North Atlantic atmosphere generally dampens these heat anomalies in time, but they're also varying spatially. The atmospheric dampening of the advected heat anomalies in the Nordic Sea leads to about 45% of the total variability. The positive heat transport anomaly during the 30s and 40s appears to be mainly a temperature anomaly subject to weak atmospheric dampening. Temperature variability is thus a combination of advective processes and local thermodynamic forcing. So basically what they're saying here is, to sum this up, try and pull this all together, is that there seems to be decadal fluctuations. These decadal fluctuations are most likely the result of variations in temperature, variations in the North Atlantic Oscillation, which means the positioning of the high and low pressure systems found around the Iceland and Canary Islands, which therefore changes the strength of the wind forcing. So therefore, this leads to variations in the volume transport in. So you have variations in temperature, thus heat content, variations in the volume transport, and this leads to variations in the heat that's moved into the Arctic Ocean. But they're also acknowledging the fact that there is an increasing trend in the volume transport and in the heat being transported into the Arctic Ocean that shows a strong anthropogenic signal, thus an anthropogenic component. So yes, over time there's variation fluctuation, but now we're seeing in the last 20, 30 years or so an increase in the heat, increase in the flow. This is due to humans burning fossil fuels, and this is affecting the ocean such that the sea ice forming in the Barents is hindered through the Fram Strait. That brings the heat in. That heat, going back to the Barents Sea, melts the ice, diffuses to the atmosphere before it moves on with still a significant heat content into the Arctic Ocean. So overall, there is a warming in the ocean, and it's bringing that warming into the Arctic region, warming the Arctic Ocean, warming the atmosphere, melting the ice. The changes, there's been fluctuations over the decades, but in recent times, it seems the human signal is starting to be a greater factor than the natural cycle signal. So that's the essence of this paper that I wanted to bring. As I said, it's very detailed. I'll leave the URL link in the comments section below. So I thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.